Welcome to the Anthro to UX podcast, where you will learn how to break into UX with an anthropology degree. Through conversations with leading anthropologists working in user experience, you will learn firsthand how others made the transition, what they learned along the way, and what they would do differently. We will be discussing what it means to do UX research from a practical perspective and what you need to do to prepare a resume and portfolio. I'm your host, Matt Artz, a business anthropologist specializing in design anthropology and working at the intersection of product management, user experience, and business strategy. Let's get started.
Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Matt Artz of Anthro to UX. I'm here today with Maria Angelica Tarazona, and she's from Bogota, Colombia, principal design researcher at Blackboard, an entrepreneur in recovery, and is a certified Scrum Master and product owner, which I am as well. So I was very interested to talk about that. So Maria, thanks for coming on. Would you mind telling everybody how you got interested in anthropology?
When I was little, I was fascinated with Egypt and the pyramids and the mummies. So I said that when I grew older, I would become to be an archaeologist, actually. But when I graduated high school, there wasn't like a professional degree for archaeology. It was a specialization that you had to do once you became an anthropologist. So that is how I began studying anthropology. And actually, I was in between anthropology and IT, like systems engineering. But I ended up choosing anthropology because I felt like I had already like that mindset, like that IT mindset, but that didn't allow me to understand like the why and to go deeper into more philosophically related questions, something like that. And so that is how I ended up studying anthropology.
And when you said you were between IT and anthropology, what gave you the interest in IT and where do you think you developed those skills?
Oh, well, first, I was that teenager that used to damage their computer until one day my parents told me, we're not going to pay for more support, so you'll have to fix it yourself. And so, but I've always been interested like in technology. I usually don't read the manual or anything that comes with whatever I buy. I just try to get there and to figure out how I can use it by myself. And I was working with Linux computers when I was in high school as well. So I always had like that affinity. And I also enjoyed researching a lot because, you know, you have to read a lot if you want to fix your computer before your parents get home.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I actually make the same exact joke. That's how I started. And so, so you have this IT interest, you end up in anthropology, but was your anthropological program supportive at all of you sort of studying or working in the IT space, or was it really much more just traditional anthropology?
In Colombia, there were back then, two major kind of like academical spaces. So the first one was like fully academical, and the other one was really field work oriented. So my university was more in that academical field. So there wasn't really that much interest in exploring how societies are working or are relating with the technological or the IT phenomena back then. And actually my professional my degree paper was about hackers and how they are like liminal subjects between feeling human but feeling cyborgs. So that was kind of like the first take on how the society, and how specifically hackers or those liminal subjects kind of like work and are like being themselves in the like in cyberspace and in the current, like the real space.
Yeah, interesting. And so how did you come to pick that topic?
So I mentioned that when I was in high school, I was working with some Linux computers. So that's where like most of my friends are, and they are part of the open software community.
Good.
And so that's how I already had the connections. And I just when I went to the university, I stayed in contact with them.
And how did the university respond to that, proposal when you first put it forward?
Oh, that was interesting. So it would depend on who would be my kind of like my coach. The original coach just loved the idea because it was something completely new. It meant that I had to create like my own framework to be able to analyze and to make sense out of what I was seeing. But then some other professors there just wanted to make it more classical, so that they wanted me to review kind of like the power relationships and stuff like that. That I did end up analyzing, but it wasn't like the main goal. I just wanted to understand like how are they creating that sense of self when most of your activities and what makes you that subject, what makes you unique, is happening in a place where no one knows who you are. Like, how do you define yourself? Like, what's that identity gonna look like? And especially because it's not you who define your identity. So when you are like in the open software community, or when you are in the cybersecurity community, it's not you who call out yourself like, I'm an expert, I'm a hacker, or whatever. It's the community. So how do you deal with, I feel like I know enough, and that I'm like an awesome hacker or something like that, but also because the community knows that I am and recognize me as one, that is when I get to call myself like a hacker, but not before that.
And so, aside from that point there, what did you find, and anything shocking to you?
Yeah. So first, that it was that like you can't call yourself whatever the name they are using, like inside the community. It's the community who tells you that you are one. But if you call yourself that before the community tells you, then you lose all the respect there. At all. They won't respect you at all. There was that. The other thing is that it's a really hands-on knowledge, and how you are sharing your knowledge with people. So that is how you become kind of like a meaningful person in the community. So if you're open and you're willing to share your knowledge, and you are, and it's more than just writing, like blog posts or tutorials. That actually the tutorials don't work as much, because if you do write them, that's also something funny. In the open source community, when you're writing tutorials, you are intentionally leaving some parts out, so that people have to work harder just to get to where you are. But it's kind of like it's kind of like how they are if you are like testing to see if they're worthy of your knowledge, kind of like that one. And also, it's not just creating like those blog posts or those tutorials, but it's kind of like providing a space where people get to use that knowledge and to build that knowledge. So it's completely different from what I had seen before. Like everyone is so, not everyone wants to share their knowledge. And I mean, even happens with like the ebooks and stuff like that, that if you get to find one of those really complicated ebooks or those resources, some people tend to just hold to them. Like, I'm not going to share it at all. But in the open source community, it's completely the opposite. So once you've managed to get access to that resource, you're going to share it to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to review them. Because after all, the community is built with the knowledge that everyone gets to create. So it's not just like you who owns that knowledge. Mm-hmm. It's the community.
Yeah, it's interesting. And so, to tie it back to UX, there's a few things there that come up. One is, to tie it back to UX, both anthropology. So there's the identity concept, which is something that also a lot of anthropologists talk about and how they associate or identify. And then in the UX space, actually, there's a lot of sharing that goes on, and it is a pretty friendly community. And so maybe using that, sort of as a jumping off point. First, let me ask you, on LinkedIn, you identify, as a business anthropologist. And so I'd like to know, why you chose to identify as that, but also if you could somehow share your story of getting from, this work that you did on hacker culture to, figuring out that UX exists. So that's kind of a two-parter, but maybe start with the business anthropology piece and we'll pick up the UX journey next.
All right. So when I was an entrepreneur, I was kind of like, aside from being the co-founder of both companies, I acted also as the product manager. So it meant that I had to figure out what the strategy for the product is going to be like and how am I going to interact with the different stakeholders. And definitely, even though it was a highly technical role, having that anthropological toolbox, if you want to call it like that, helped me to get first to identify what the actual ask was, like what their problem was, to see if I could solve it with my product or not. And also, it allowed me to see that usually those problems or like those challenges are not only like IT related, but they are kind of like strategically related. Like there is something else going on behind the IT or technological ask that you're getting from those technical stakeholders. And so what ended up happening is that I would go there, try to fix or to provide a solution for their tech problem. And then I ended up becoming kind of like an advisor on several areas that didn't really have to do specifically with telco or telecommunications. That is where my company was, like in that market segment. And so, but once I left my last startup, I just like didn't know what I could do because I had a highly technical knowledge. I was coding in Python, in PHP, you name it. I was managing Linux servers. I mean, it was a highly technical role. But then again, I had that anthropological toolbox, and I was like, okay, so what can I do? I mean, I don't have like a bachelor's in IT or something like that. So, and that is how I ended up in the UX community. I was trying to find a place to myself, kind of to build back that identity, because I wasn't an entrepreneur anymore. And that was a huge part of my identity. And so that is why I called myself an entrepreneur in recovery. Mm-hmm. And so while I was transitioning, I got to study and to see like what was going out there, like what are the current jobs for anthropologists. And they were all talking about UX research, which I thought it made sense. I mean, we are, one of our methodologies is ethnography, and that is what we've been doing for quite a while. But what really stood out is the service design. And that is taking, again, kind of like defining the overall strategy for the product or the service, and not just focusing on a touch point or something like that. Mm-hmm. And that is how it all clicked. Like my previous experience as a product manager, and also the anthropological toolbox, because I had that 360 vision of the business and of the needs, and I wasn't just like focused on a single like feature, mm-hmm. Because I'm like a big picture thinker, and so that is how I ended up becoming a service designer at a BPO company. It's one of those companies that that sells services for kind of like payroll, payments, contact centers, stuff like that. And I got to work with financial institutions, insurance companies, telecommunications. So I had access to like a lot of markets, and I got to see like what their struggles were and their challenges. And I was also part of the innovation sale there. Mm-hmm. So I felt like everything clicked, and like I had found my niche. So yeah.
So, in this journey to UX, you've been in product roles, service design, now UX. So is there any one space that you think fits best, given, your interest in IT and your background in anthropology?
I would say where I am right now. So in terms of the UX maturity of the companies, we are now transitioning from kind of like being effective and we're doing things, but there are some conversations going on about how what we're doing from research is going to influence the overall company's strategy and not just product strategy. And I feel like, some companies are mature enough to have those conversations. Again, it depends on the product, the maturity of the product, and also the maturity in terms of UX of the team's product as well. And so now that we have that space, we are able to use some concepts from the academy, for example, because there is like a wealth of knowledge there, and not all the companies are tapping into that, for example. Right now, the business stakeholders are really focused on how this like overarching questions are going to help them figure out what their value is. And it's more about more than just creating the feature, but rather focusing on the outcome.
Sure. So, you're describing the improving maturity there of the organization. Would you say that that is a result of where you are, or do you think that's also reflective of the UX scene in Colombia as a whole?
I'd say both. So right now, the UX market here is growing, definitely. And there is that need for those strategic roles. Not all of the designers want to step into that role. Mm-hmm. And so there is definitely a space there. And but again, it ties back to the maturity of the company. If it's like one of those established companies, again, a financial institution, it's harder to get to have those meaningful conversations. Like, I used to work in one of the chatbots. I was designing the overall experience and also like the conversations, kind of like a conversational designer, but it wasn't like an actual role. And so, but my questions to the bank were like, so how do you envision this? Like, where do you want to take this new communication channel? And they were always thinking about today, like what I need to address today, instead of taking a step back and to see how this communication channel could become something else, and whether it was helping their customers or not. Mm-hmm. So it was really difficult for me to have those conversations with them because they weren't ready. And it's different from where I am right now, where I see and I hear all the time, like the business stakeholders always mentioning the personas and the outcomes and the challenges, and not just, like providing lip service to it, but also like they are interested in getting some answers for those overarching questions.
So now, one last question about the scene in Colombia. I see when looking, just on the internet, that both UX and service design are talked about quite a bit there these days. Now in the States, UX really dominates. Service design is still kind of taking a back seat to it, whereas service design in Europe is quite popular, of course, as well. So, different places around the globe sort of have different orientations. Would you say that one or the other in Colombia is leading? Like, are more companies looking for service designers or more looking for UX, or are they sort of equal?
I think that there is a lot of misunderstanding on what the term UX or how you are going to help the company when you are in that role. So there is some overlap, definitely, but some professionals end up like transitioning into service design. They just don't know it. So if you are working, say, like in a software company where you are developing solutions, probably you won't have that service design experience because you're just focused on delivering the product and that's it. But if you are in a service company, just again, like the BPO that I was in, then there is where it makes sense to have someone like dedicated to designing the overall service. And I feel like some companies hire some UX professionals hoping that they would have that 360 vision of the business, and that's not usually the case. And especially because some companies are framing their problem as a user experience problem, and it's actually a service design. But since they're not that mature, then they don't know what to look for.
Mm-hmm. So that brings up an interesting point there. Earlier you said that designers might not be looking for strategic roles, and sort of in your last response, you also kind of point to different people having different understandings and capabilities. Now, you bring an interesting skill set to the table, given your IT background, and of course also sort of being certified in Scrum and as a product owner. And so I'm curious to know, from your perspective, what you think that gives you, what kind of advantage you think that gives you maybe over others that are in similar roles. And I ask that with the intention of kind of, getting to a conversation about should other people who are training to work in UX consider such things. So again, what advantage do you think that confers on you?
When you are designing from, say you're tasked with designing a product, but that product is part of a bigger product ecosystem, and that product is going to use some of the resources that the company already has. So if you come to the table with the design skill set, you would go there and you would try to identify what the user problem is, what they're doing right now. Hopefully you will be able to have like some co-design workshops with them to design, for the lack of a better word, like the workflows. And then you would design how the UI is going to look like, and you would do some tests, and then you would hand it over to development. And that's kind of like where you are. But in real life, what usually happens is that each one of the components that your product is going to have probably is going to interact somehow with the resources that the company has. A database, the customer service, like if they are some like external services or like external databases or stuff like that. So the way that you envision your product is going to work doesn't really happen because you're not asking those questions to the technical people, like to the IT, like the architects or stuff like that. And first, because you don't know that that could happen, because you haven't been like exposed to situations like that where you have to kind of like work around what you've got to be able to deliver what you promised. That's one thing. And the other thing is that you don't know who to ask. And if you get into those technical conversations, then you can easily get lost, or that sometimes that happens. And not only in UX, but this probably has to do also with how technology works here in Colombia, is that if you don't prove your worth, kind of like if you don't prove the architects or the IT staff that you understand and that you are capable to ask the real questions and that you understand the answers that they're giving you, they're not going to talk to you. And so it's tricky because not everyone has that IT background, and not everyone has, again, like that 360 vision to know what to ask and where and to whom. And so that's how I feel that my experience and my knowledge has helped me a lot while I was transitioning, and now that I'm fully dedicated to UX, because I tend to think of myself as kind of like a bridge between technical stakeholders and non-technical stakeholders and the developers and the users, because I can translate whatever they are telling me into like the other's language. And so that is how I felt like I needed to have more knowledge. So not just technical knowledge, but also how knowing how they are working right now. So with the agile methodologies, like how the different ceremonies are working, to know where and how I could influence those decisions. So that is why I certified as a Scrum Master and as a product owner. Because now I can also, like, I feel comfortable having those conversations. Like, if you want to go, like, because I mean, that happens. Like, everyone is is using the terms, but there is like not much conversation going on, but just like saying like flashy terms. But now I know what they're talking about.
Yeah, learning the language, one of the first tasks we have to engage in.
Exactly.
So, you had a little head start. Well, let me say, I would agree with you that tech skills are very beneficial in a UX role. My background is business and tech, pretty much all the way up until I studied anthropology. And so I always have brought that into the work that I do, and have always found it helpful to be a culture broker, to translate, as you're saying, and do recommend such things to everybody else. But I don't always get to talk to people on the show who themselves also kind of come from a tech background. So, if you were to do this all over again, or if you were to make recommendations for somebody else who didn't grow up, breaking their computer and playing with Linux, what kind of skills would you recommend that somebody develops today? Because, and let me preface that by saying, not everybody's going to go out and pay for certain certifications, right? So, you can't do everything. So what would you think is maybe most effective to develop other skills that you see UX researchers could benefit from? That could be the tech skills, but it could also be other things like business and strategy, whatever you think. What would be best for people to engage in?
I would say that it would depend on what your end goal is going to be. So if your passion is design and you want to have, like an impact in the overall process, then just learning how tech works. And let me rephrase that, like, it's not like learning to code is not as difficult right now as it was a while. I mean, Python is pretty simple, but it helps you to connect the dots. Like, that's the beauty of programming, that you get to see like each one of the elements, and inside your head, then you arrange them and you get an outcome, you get an output, and that's it. And so when you are, if you learn how to code, then you would also understand how a developer's mind works. And so that helps you kind of like empathize with them, because when we're talking about being empathic to our users, it not only relates to our external users or to our external customers, but also the internal customers, the product teams, the product managers, the developers. And so I feel like that is where the overall UX community could be. There's like some room for improvement there, like also being empathetic with our developers. And that means trying to get into that developer mindset. And if one of your goals is to influence the overall company strategy, then that is how like those certifications for product manager or product owner, or even just learning project management skills will get you there. Because, and this is like an entirely different conversation, but the way that some teams and that some areas of the companies think of UX is like that we have no process whatsoever. Like, we just wake up someday and we decided that we were going to go with this design, and that's it. And if you are lacking that project management skills, then the teams are not going to feel comfortable with you taking the lead or managing some projects. And once you get that buy-in, like showing them that there is like an actual process and that each one of the questions that you're asking has, like a goal in mind, that's when you get that seat in the table. And I know that everyone talks about wanting to have that seat in the table, but that seat is because you have proved yourself worthy of being there. And that is that you are okay with engaging with business stakeholders, and that you get to prove your business case, like the why we're going to do this using hard data and tying it back to the company's strategy. And so that kind of conversations is what gets you in the table. And unless you're able to manage like the projects, like the small projects, it's going to be almost impossible for you to get to earn those spaces.
Yeah, it's a good point, because having the seat at the table comes up frequently, especially there's somewhat of some people talk about how we don't have much influence ultimately, right? We hand it over to a product manager, and they may or may not necessarily adopt all the findings and look to have them implemented. And so increasing our influence is important, but I guess that brings up the point that we don't only have to also work in UX roles. And so, given your experience, would you recommend like product roles to other anthropologists? Do you think that's a fit? And do you see other roles that you think would be a fit for anthropologists, given all your sort of tech background?
Yeah, definitely a product manager is something that we can do. Because as an anthropologist, we are focused also like in the bigger picture. Like we are connected the dots outside what we've been given, we try to look past whatever we have, like in that first approach to the concept or to the situation or whatever. But also roles in innovation, it's where we can have like a greater impact, especially because it relates to culture. So and I feel like that's one of those spaces where the anthropologists haven't really explored that much. But if you take a look at the design thinking methodology and how everything is like laid out there, and the double diamond, and so that kind of process, it's kind of like the same that we've been doing all along, like discovering how people are doing things right now, like what they are doing, what they're struggling with, to understand like the why they're doing it. And so that's kind of like where we have been like working all along. But if what you want is to influence, then you have to move into the next step of the process, and that is the solution discovery and the concept validation. And that the whole process is part of the innovation activities that you get to do in a company. And again, we're working with culture, like, because the change aversion is true, like it happens everywhere. And you have to earn that trust again. And you have to prove that your process is something that people could and should trust. And so you would be talking again with a lot of people, trying to understand how they're working right now, like what are who the key stakeholders are, who are like behind, like the power behind the curtains and stuff like that. And there is a great opportunity for us to have that greater impact if we are part of the innovation, either an innovation cell or an innovation team inside a company. So that's one thing. And also when it comes to employee experience, like in HR, especially now with the Great Resignation, I feel like we could provide so much insight on why people are leaving the companies. And it's more than just saying, oh, it's the millennials or it's the baby boomers or whatever, or the centennials even. And I feel like there is some space there. It kind of relates to user experience, but the approach is completely different. And because usually what happens is that people get frustrated because they don't see the change happening fast. But it doesn't matter if you are a designer or an anthropologist. I mean, that's how people kind of like react to the different circumstances. But if you want to have that impact, like if you want to see the outcome of what your research and what your activities have had over like a group of people, then definitely going into employee experience is something that you should take a look at, because the results are there like within a month. It's amazing. And you get to have that. Well, people really, when you're doing that kind of activities, first, people are eager to talk to you. That is different from like working in UX, definitely. And second, they really care. The fact that you see them. So usually what happens is that in a company, you're just a number and that's it. But when you, as an anthropologist, are approaching to them just to learn how they're doing their daily course or their day-to-day activities, what their struggles are, how are they relating with their managers or with their co-workers, it's amazing how people react. Like when they thank you, it comes like from the bottom of their heart because you heard them. And that's complete. That doesn't, it doesn't happen like that when you're in UX. Like it does sometimes, but it's not always like that. But especially in employee experience, you get to have like that emotional satisfaction that you're actually improving someone's life.
Yeah, I think the employee experience is a good recommendation. It's something I haven't really talked about yet on the podcast. And it reminds me that I need to get somebody on who's dedicated in that space. But I also thank you for sharing everything you think about product. You know, I would suggest that I too suggest that other anthropologists look into those roles. I've also had in the past somebody who's an engineer themselves. And while I agree with your earlier comments that, you know, I think having an understanding of how writing, you know, code, you know, having that understanding helps you sort of empathize and just understand the process. My guess is that's also not going to be you know, the main thing that people look at after UX, you know, jumping from anthropology to engineering. However, there's a sort of a middle of the road there, which is we also have the opportunity to work with data science and contribute, you know, helping with our explanatory power, kind of helping explain why, right, within the data. And so, do you have any experience down in Colombia? What's the data science community look like down there? Are they open to working with social scientists? And is there any kind of, you know, nice relationship happening there?
Not much. But I'm guessing if someone is to make that first contact, it should be the anthropologists, not the developers, because how they work, how they understand things. So that's one thing. But I have I know an anthropologist who is also a data scientist. Actually, two of them. And I feel like that kind of shows that anthropology is evolving, because back then when I graduated from the university, I probably was one of the few anthropologists that coded anything. Mm-hmm. But now, because, and I feel like it's almost like cutting the middleman. Like, if you're able to get into the data itself and to ask the questions that you want to get answers, and again, arranging the query in a way that it makes sense to you, you're gonna get a wealth of information there. And sometimes trying to explain to what you're trying to, like the information that you're trying to get to a data scientist is complicated. But it's not because they don't understand, it's because we are not prepared to tell the story in a way that they understand. And so it would depend. If you are, because there are some anthropologists that just love data. And if you're able to deep dive into the data itself, it opens a world of possibilities. And I feel like if you are able to have that data mindset, it helps you a lot, especially when you are creating that business case and when you are sharing it with stakeholders. Because, and this is a sad story, but data and numbers rule the business.
Yeah, for sure. Still. And that's likely not going away anytime soon. Or in fact, it might even be increasing with, with the love of big data and AI and et cetera. But great. So thanks for sharing all that. I appreciate your tech perspective, as an anthropologist. What's next for you? And I don't mean, company, from a different company, but I mean, you obviously have varied interests, from tech and strategy. And so, what are you going to try and do to make yourself a better researcher? Is there any skills that you want to pick up?
I've been exploring the quantitative methodologies a lot. I've been using the Kano analysis a lot. It's great, especially where I am right now, because you get to have that hard data. So it's not just I went there and asked people if you want to take a look at the population and what they answered and how I created this matrix, go ahead, you can do it. And again, because it's not one of the most common methodologies to use. There are ones the most known, the user interviews or the A/B testing, or the usability test, or even a heuristic analysis. But they are not that. They don't provide that much hard data. There's still a highly qualitative component to them. And I feel that's kind of where I am right now, to share that knowledge with people. There is much more to UX research than just doing interviews or usability tests. We can be as precise and as and we could have kind of that methodology, that rigorous methodology or that rigorous process that all the development teams have. We can be as rigorous as you want to, but it isn't about what the stakeholders want, but what I want to have for my process. And that is why everything in the UX research team is mapped out, and it is part of a process, and the process is nicely outlined, and it has like all of the questions that we're gonna ask here, and this is what we're gonna do with the information, so that whenever I'm approaching like the different stakeholders, it isn't just because, oh, I just woke up one day and thought this would be the greatest solution, but rather like this is my process, and this is where you and I can work together to first identify the outcome. That's like something that's another conversation, that everyone's like so focused on the feature instead of the actual outcome. But going back to my point, it's we're gonna identify the outcome, and this is where we're gonna work together to find the solution, and then test, validate the solution with potential users or customers. And this is how the overall dual track agile process is gonna look like in terms of research and design. So that's kind of like where I am right now, like trying to establish the process to get that buy-in.
Yeah, very good. Well, sounds like a good project to be working on. Obviously, it will help with, gain trust from your team, help, improve the maturity, all the things that you talked about today. So I thank you for sharing what you're working on. Is there anything, work related or outside of work that you're also engaged in that you'd like to just maybe mention, or, feel free, take the floor to kind of plug anything you might wish.
Yeah, I'm also part of the UXPA chapter in Colombia. And that has helped me a lot. So that is also something that I wanted to share with you. And that is when you get into the UX research or into a UX design field, it's good to have, like a coach, like a career coach, or like a mentor, someone that you can reach out to whenever you have questions. Mm-hmm. And it isn't just about, oh, what methodology should I use in this case, but it's someone who is willing to share with you like their struggles, like, because there is no need to reinvent the wheel. And so I strongly advise everyone who is thinking of moving into the UX field to try to find a coach or a mentor, because it helps you a lot. And especially when you are dealing with complicated situations, they've been there and they can share how they approached that situation in the past, what worked, what didn't. And it helps you a lot, because when you are when you are proposing, say, a solution or a path forward specifically to that situation, you're coming from your experience, but also your coach experience. Like, it's not just you alone facing that situation. So that really helps. And that is where I feel like having those communities, like the professionals communities, is definitely something that we should all try to create and to grow, because the discussions there are different. There are some spaces, like if you're just transitioning into UXD, then knowing what tools to use is great, like what methodologies to use also. But when you have that professionals community, then the conversations are around research ops or design ops, or what kind of research repository should we use? How are we communicating the research results to the stakeholders? Like, or how do I get that buy-in? Like, how do I get the product team involved? And it's like a different level of conversation. And that has to happen if one of our goals is to take our companies into the next UX maturity level. And I feel like that that situation doesn't have that much visibility right now, at least in Colombia. Mm-hmm. And there is a huge opportunity there.
Yeah, well, great advice for sure. So if anybody wanted to get in touch with you, whether in Colombia or really anywhere, to learn more about your perspective, how can they find you?
They can find me in LinkedIn. I'll share the profile link.
Yeah, I'll link to it. Great.
Yeah.
Well, Maria, thanks for coming on. It was a pleasure to chat with you.
Well, thanks, Matt, for having me. Have a nice day.
Take care.
Thank you all for listening to the Anthro to UX podcast. To learn everything you need to break into UX, visit anthro2ux.com. There you will find all the podcast episodes and career coaching resources. Please like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.